before a single word of the Declaration of Independence was written, before the revolutionary pamphlets circulated through colonial taverns, before the name Thomas Jefferson meant anything to anyone beyond a small corner of Virginia's Piedmont, there was a landscape. And it was this landscape, as much as any book or mentor or political crisis, that made him. The Virginia Piedmont in the early 18th century was a world of extraordinary physical beauty and profound moral darkness, and it is impossible to understand the man who emerged from it without first understanding both of those things simultaneously. The rolling red clay hills stretched westward from the Tidewater coast toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, whose long, hazy silhouette marked the edge of the known colonial world. Dense hardwood forests of oak, hickory, and chestnut covered the ridgelines. Tobacco fields, red-brown and pungent in the summer heat, cut geometric patterns into the hillsides. Rivers ran clear over limestone beds. The air smelled of pine resin and turned earth, and always the particular sweetness of tobacco curing in wooden barns. This was a world built on a contradiction so fundamental that it had become invisible to most of those who benefited from it. The great planters of colonial Virginia, the Carters, the Byards, the Randolphs, the Lees, lived lives of genuine refinement and intellectual aspiration, modeling themselves on the English landed gentry, filling their libraries with Locke and Addison and Pope, corresponding with London merchants and Edinburgh philosophers, debating the finer points of English constitutional law over Madeira wine in candlelit dining rooms. And all of it, every book, every bottle, every brick of every great house, rested on the labor of enslaved African men, women, and children who had no voice in the society their work sustained. Into this world, on April 13, 1743, Thomas Jefferson was born at Shadwell Plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia. His father, Peter Jefferson, was not born to the planter aristocracy. He was a self-made man in the most literal colonial sense, a surveyor and cartographer of considerable skill who had risen through the acquisition of land, the cultivation of tobacco, and a strategically advantageous marriage. In 1739, Peter Jefferson married Jane Randolph, connecting himself to one of Virginia's most distinguished and socially prominent dynasties. The Randolphs traced their lineage to the English gentry and occupied a position of genuine social prestige in colonial Virginia. Through this marriage, Peter Jefferson's children would be born not merely into comfort, but into the upper tier of colonial society, with all the educational and social opportunities that entailed. Shadwell itself was a working plantation, not the grandest estate in Virginia by any measure, but a substantial and productive operation. The tobacco fields required constant labor, and that labor was provided by enslaved people whose names appear in the plantation's records, but whose inner lives remain largely inaccessible to history. The rhythms of Shadwell were agricultural rhythms, planting and cultivation and harvest, the seasons marking time with the particular urgency of a tobacco economy, where a bad crop meant financial ruin. Peter Jefferson managed this operation with the practical competence of a man who had built his own prosperity from the ground up, and he instilled in his eldest son a respect for physical knowledge, for surveying and mapping, and the direct understanding of the natural world that would persist throughout Jefferson's life. Young Thomas grew up in this landscape, with the freedom that the children of wealthy planters enjoyed, and the enslaved children around them did not. He explored the forests of Albemarle County with the unself-conscious liberty of a boy who had never been told that any part of the natural world was beyond his reach. The mountains were always there, the Blue Ridge visible on clear days from the higher ground near Shadwell, their blue-gray profiles suggesting a world beyond the plantation's boundaries. Jefferson would later write about those mountains with a reverence that bordered on the spiritual, and it is not difficult to understand why. For a boy of his temperament, curious, observant, drawn to order and beauty, the mountains represented something permanent and magnificent in a world that was otherwise defined by the contingencies of weather, market prices, and human mortality. Peter Jefferson died in August 1757 when Thomas was 14 years old. The death of a father is always a rupture, but this particular rupture carried consequences that extended far beyond grief. Under the terms of Peter Jefferson's will, Thomas inherited approximately 2,750 acres of land in Albemarle County, and crucially, the enslaved people who worked that land. At 14 years old, Thomas Jefferson became simultaneously an orphan and a slaveholder. These two facts arrived together, inseparable, and they would remain inseparable for the rest of his life. The inheritance placed Jefferson in a position that was both privileged and precarious. He was now, on paper, a man of property, but he was also a boy without a father in a society where patronage and family connections were essential to advancement. His mother Jane managed the household, but the intellectual and social guidance that Peter Jefferson had provided was gone. What filled that void in the years immediately following his father's death was education. Jefferson's formal schooling had begun early, as was customary for boys of his class. He had studied Latin and Greek at local schools, developing the linguistic facility that would serve him throughout his life. But it was his enrollment in the school of Reverend James Morey, a classical scholar of genuine distinction who operated a small academy in Albemarle County, that provided the intellectual foundation upon which everything else would be built. Under Morey's instruction, Jefferson immersed himself in the classical curriculum of the 18th century educated gentleman. Latin authors, Cicero, Virgil, Horace, Livy, read in the original. Greek texts approached with similar rigor. History both ancient and modern. Natural philosophy in the tradition of the early Enlightenment. Morey was not merely a teacher of languages and dates. He was a man who believed that the study of classical civilization could illuminate the principles of good government, virtuous conduct, and rational inquiry. And this belief, transmitted to his most gifted pupil, would shape Jefferson's intellectual character in ways that persisted for the rest of his life. The classical world that Jefferson encountered through Morey's instruction was not merely an academic subject. It was a living intellectual resource, a repository of political wisdom, philosophical argument, and aesthetic achievement that Jefferson would draw upon continuously. The Roman Republic, with its ideals of civic virtue and its warnings about the corruption of power, became a kind of template against which Jefferson measured the political world around him. The Greek philosophers provided frameworks for thinking about ethics, knowledge, and the good life. The Enlightenment thinkers who built upon this classical foundation, Locke, Newton, Bacon, were already beginning to reshape Jefferson's understanding of what human reason could achieve. But Maury's school existed in Albemarle County, Virginia, in the 1750s, and the world it occupied was not the world of Athenian philosophy or Roman civic virtue. It was a world of tobacco and slavery, of plantation agriculture and racial hierarchy, of a colonial society that had constructed its material prosperity on the systematic denial of the humanity of a significant portion of its population. Jefferson absorbed the classical curriculum and the Enlightenment philosophy simultaneously with the assumptions of his slave-owning class, and he would spend the rest of his life unable or unwilling to fully resolve the tension between them. By 1760, Jefferson was 17 years old, tall and angular and red-haired, possessed of an intellectual appetite that had already outgrown what Albemarle County could offer. The decision was made by Jefferson himself, with the support of his guardians, to send him to Williamsburg, Virginia's colonial capital, to attend the College of William and Mary. The road from Shadwell to Williamsburg ran east through the Piedmont and down toward the Tidewater, leaving the mountains behind and moving toward the coastal world of colonial politics and commerce. As Jefferson rode that road for the first time, he carried with him everything that Shadwell and Albemarle County had given him. The landscape's beauty lodged permanently in his imagination, the classical education that had taught him to think in terms of principles and precedents, the social confidence of a young man born into Virginia's gentry class, and the moral inheritance of a slave-owning society that he had absorbed so completely he had not yet begun to question it. He also carried, though he could not yet have articulated it, the particular restlessness of a mind that had already sensed the distance between the ideals it had been taught to admire and the world it had been born into. The Blue Ridge receded behind him as the road wound eastward. The mountains that had anchored his childhood would remain throughout his life, the place he returned to when the world became too much, the fixed point against which all his wandering, intellectual and geographical, would be measured. But on that morning in 1760, they were behind him, and everything that would make Thomas Jefferson one of the most consequential and contradictory figures in American history lay ahead. Williamsburg in 1760 was the most politically charged square mile in colonial Virginia, and for a young man arriving from the relative isolation of Albemarle County, it must have felt like stepping into a different civilization entirely. The wide, unpaved expanse of Duke of Gloucester Street stretched nearly a mile from the College of William and Mary at its western end to the elegant Georgian facade of the Capitol building at its eastern terminus, a deliberate urban axis that announced, in the language of colonial town planning, the twin authorities of learning and governance. Between those two anchors, the town hummed with the particular energy of a place where ideas and power were in constant, productive collision. The physical world of Williamsburg was modest by European standards, a colonial capital of perhaps 2,000 permanent residents, its streets dusty in summer and muddy in winter, its buildings a mixture of substantial brick and more modest timber construction. But what it lacked in scale, it compensated for in intensity. The governor's palace, with its formal gardens and iron gates, represented the reach of crown authority into colonial life. The Raleigh Tavern, its Apollo Room a gathering place for planters, lawyers, and merchants, was where the real political conversations happened, where tobacco smoke and Madeira wine loosened tongues and sharpened arguments, where the grievances of Virginia's gentry class found their first articulate expressions. The Capitol building, where the House of Burgesses met in its panelled chamber, was the stage upon which Virginia's political drama played out with increasing urgency as the decade wore on. Jefferson arrived at the College of William and Mary in the spring of 1760, and what he found there would transform him in ways that Reverend Morey's classical curriculum, for all its rigor, had not prepared him for. The college was a small institution by any measure, a handful of buildings arranged around a courtyard, a faculty of modest distinction, a student body drawn largely from the sons of Virginia's planter class. But within that modest institution, Jefferson encountered a man who would change the direction of his intellectual life entirely. William Small was a Scottish professor of natural philosophy and mathematics who had arrived at William and Mary in 1758, bringing with him the full force of the Scottish Enlightenment, that extraordinary flowering of rational inquiry that had produced David Hume, Adam Smith, and Francis Hutcheson, and that had made Edinburgh one of the intellectual capitals of the Western world. Small was, by all accounts, an exceptional teacher, systematic, rigorous, genuinely curious, and possessed of the rare ability to communicate not merely the content of ideas, but the excitement of thinking itself. Jefferson would later write, with the measured precision he brought to all his assessments, that Small had fixed the destinies of his life. Through Small's instruction and mentorship, Jefferson encountered the intellectual trinity he would later describe as the three greatest men who ever lived: John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. These were not merely names on a reading list. They represented, taken together, a complete epistemological revolution, a new way of understanding how human beings acquire knowledge, what that knowledge can tell us about the natural and political world, and what follows from those conclusions for the organization of human society. Bacon's insistence on empirical observation as the foundation of knowledge, Newton's demonstration that the natural world operated according to discoverable rational laws, and Locke's argument that political authority derived not from divine right, but from the consent of the governed. These ideas, absorbed by a young Virginian of extraordinary intellectual capacity, were not merely academic propositions. They were, in the most literal sense, revolutionary. Jefferson's years at William and Mary were characterized by an intensity of intellectual engagement that bordered on the compulsive. He was known to study for 15 hours a day, pausing only for a daily run at dusk that he maintained as a lifelong habit. He read voraciously and systematically, keeping meticulous notes in the commonplace books that survive as evidence of his developing mind. He mastered French and Italian alongside the Latin and Greek he had acquired under Morey. He pursued mathematics with genuine passion. He played the violin with enough skill to participate in the musical evenings that Small organized at the governor's palace, where Jefferson was welcomed into the intimate circle of Small, Governor Francis Fauquier, and the lawyer George Wythe. A gathering of four minds that Jefferson would later describe as the finest conversation he had ever known. George Wythe deserves particular attention because it was under his guidance that Jefferson's education moved from philosophy to law, and it was in the law that his political philosophy would find its practical application. Wythe was, by the consensus of his contemporaries, the finest legal mind in colonial Virginia, a classical scholar, a meticulous legal reasoner, and a man of genuine moral seriousness, who would later become one of the first prominent Americans to argue publicly for the abolition of slavery. Jefferson read law under Wythe's supervision for 5 years, from roughly 1762 to 1767, in an apprenticeship that was far more intellectually rigorous than the simple copying of legal forms that passed for legal education in most colonial offices. Under Wythe's direction, Jefferson worked through the great texts of English common law, Coke upon Littleton, the reports of English courts, the constitutional history of Parliament and the Crown, alongside the natural law theorists whose arguments were reshaping political philosophy across the Atlantic world. What emerged from this immersion was not merely a competent lawyer, but a political thinker who understood the relationship between legal precedent and natural right, between the specific provisions of English constitutional law and the broader principles of human freedom that those provisions were meant to protect. Jefferson came to believe with increasing conviction that the rights of Englishmen and of all human beings derived not from royal grant or parliamentary statute, but from natural law itself, and that any government that violated those rights had forfeited its claim to legitimate authority. Jefferson was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1767, and he practiced law successfully for the next several years, handling a substantial caseload that ranged from land disputes to criminal matters. He was a competent advocate, but his heart was never fully in the courtroom. He was, as his contemporaries recognized, and as he himself acknowledged, more interested in the principles behind the law than in its daily application, more drawn to the library than the bar, more comfortable with a quill than with oral argument. What the legal practice gave him, beyond income, was an intimate knowledge of Virginia's social and economic landscape. The land disputes and debt cases that passed through his office were a window into the material realities of colonial life, including the legal structures that underpinned the institution of slavery. The political atmosphere of Williamsburg had been changing throughout Jefferson's years of study, and by the time he was admitted to the bar, it had become electric with tension. The Stamp Act of 1765, Parliament's attempt to raise revenue from the colonies by taxing legal documents, newspapers, and commercial papers, had provoked a furious colonial response. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry had risen to deliver resolutions against the Stamp Act that stopped just short of outright defiance of the Crown, and the chamber had erupted in the kind of passionate political argument that Jefferson, then a law student observing from the doorway, found both thrilling and clarifying. The argument was not merely about taxes. It was about the fundamental question of whether Parliament had any legitimate authority to legislate for colonies that had no representation in its chambers. And Jefferson, steeped in Locke and natural law theory, had already formed his answer. His election to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1769 brought him formally into the political arena he had been observing from its margins. The assembly room at the Capitol, its Windsor chairs arranged in careful rows, the smell of candle wax and wood polish hanging in the air, the portraits of English monarchs looking down with increasing irrelevance from the panelled walls, became the stage for Jefferson's political apprenticeship. He was not, by temperament or inclination, an orator. He spoke rarely and without distinction in formal debate, preferring to work through writing and private conversation. But as a drafter of resolutions, a writer of committee reports, a man who could translate political argument into precise and elegant prose, he quickly established himself as a figure of unusual importance. The construction of Monticello, begun in 1768, was proceeding simultaneously with Jefferson's political education. The two projects, architectural and political, reflecting the same underlying impulse toward rational design and deliberate self-creation. Jefferson had chosen the summit of a small mountain in Albemarle County, a site his father had owned, a place he had loved since childhood, as the location for his home, and the choice said something essential about his character. Building on a mountaintop was impractical, expensive, and technically demanding. It required leveling the summit, constructing roads up steep slopes, solving engineering problems that a more conventional site would never have presented. Jefferson chose it anyway because the view was magnificent and the elevation was symbolic. A home that looked out over the landscape rather than merely occupying it. Jefferson's marriage. To Martha Wales Skelton in January 1772 brought him personal happiness and almost immediately a profound moral complication. Martha was a widow of 23, accomplished, warm, and possessed of a musical sensibility that complemented Jefferson's own. Their marriage was, by all available evidence, genuinely affectionate. But when Martha's father John Wales died in 1773, his estate passed to his daughter, and that estate included approximately 135 enslaved people, among them the Hemings family, whose connection to the Wales household was intimate and deeply troubling. It was widely understood, though not publicly acknowledged, that John Wales had fathered several children with an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings. Among those children was a girl named Sally Hemings, who was thus Martha Jefferson's half-sister in blood, though not in law or in social standing. The inheritance nearly doubled the enslaved population at Monticello. Jefferson, the Enlightenment idealist, who had been reading Locke on natural rights and drafting resolutions against parliamentary tyranny, was simultaneously Jefferson, the expanding slaveholder, whose material world grew larger and more dependent on coerced human labor with each passing year. The documentary pauses here, as it must, to insist on the full weight of this fact. These were not separate Jeffersons, the philosopher and the planter, inhabiting different compartments of a divided life. They were one man, and the tension between his stated principles and his lived reality was not an oversight or a temporary inconsistency. It was the defining condition of his existence, present from the moment he inherited his father's land at 14, deepening with every passing year. By 1774, Jefferson had produced his most substantial political writing to date, a pamphlet titled A Summary View of the Rights of British America, drafted as instructions for the Virginia delegation to the First Continental Congress. The argument it made was radical in its clarity. Parliament had no legitimate authority over the American colonies whatsoever. Rights derived from natural law, not from royal grant. The colonists owed personal allegiance to the king as a voluntary compact, but that compact could be dissolved if the king failed in his obligations. Jefferson was not yet calling for independence. That step remained a year away. But the intellectual architecture of the argument he would make in Philadelphia in 1776 was already fully constructed. The young man who had arrived in Williamsburg 14 years earlier, carrying his classical education and his unexamined inheritance, had become something new. A revolutionary thinker, standing at the edge of a world about to be remade. No document in the history of democratic governance has traveled further from the room in which it was written. The Declaration of Independence began as a committee assignment, a practical political task given to a 33-year-old Virginia lawyer in a rented room on a sweltering Philadelphia street, and became the founding statement of a nation's moral identity, cited and contested and reinterpreted across 2.5 centuries by people its author could never have imagined. To understand what happened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, it is necessary to understand both the extraordinary achievement and the foundational compromise that were written into the document simultaneously, in the same hand, with the same quill. Philadelphia in June of 1776 was the largest city in colonial America, a bustling, cosmopolitan port of perhaps 30,000 inhabitants, its red brick streets and Georgian facades reflecting the confident prosperity of a merchant city that had grown rich on Atlantic trade. The Delaware River carried ships from London, Bristol, Lisbon, and the Caribbean. The printing houses on Market Street produced newspapers and pamphlets that circulated throughout the colonies, carrying the arguments of revolution to audiences from Georgia to Massachusetts. The city smelled of river water and horse dung, and the particular metallic tang of a place where iron and commerce and ideas were all being worked simultaneously into new shapes. Into this city, in the late spring of 1775, delegates from the 13 colonies had gathered for the Second Continental Congress, a body that had been meeting with increasing urgency and increasingly radical purpose for over a year by the time Jefferson arrived as part of the Virginia delegation in June 1775. The Congress was not yet a government. It had no formal constitutional authority, no treasury, no army of its own, though it had, in a move of enormous consequence, appointed George Washington as commander of the Continental forces the previous summer. It was, in the most precise sense, a revolutionary body, a gathering of men who had stepped outside the existing legal order to create something new, and who understood, with varying degrees of clarity and courage, exactly what that step meant. Jefferson arrived in Philadelphia carrying his reputation as a gifted writer and political thinker, a reputation established primarily by a summary view of the rights of British America, which had circulated widely enough to make his name known to delegates from other colonies. He was tall, angular, and notably quiet in formal debate, preferring the work of committees and correspondence to the theater of floor speeches. John Adams, who had observed Jefferson closely since his arrival, would later recall that Jefferson had a happy talent of composition and a peculiar felicity of expression, a judgment that captures precisely why Jefferson was the man the Committee of Five would turn to when the moment came. The atmosphere of Philadelphia in the early summer of 1776 was one of extraordinary tension, a mixture of revolutionary fervor and existential anxiety that pervaded every conversation, every committee meeting, every meal at the city tavern where delegates gathered in the evenings. The men in that city knew, with a clarity that later generations sometimes lose sight of, that they were committing treason against the British Crown. They were not writing pamphlets or passing resolutions. They were formally severing the political bonds that connected 13 colonies to the most powerful empire on earth, and they were doing so in the middle of a war whose outcome was far from certain. Failure meant not merely political defeat, but the gallows, the pledge of lives, fortunes, and sacred honor that would close the declaration was not rhetorical flourish. It was a literal statement of what was at stake. The movement toward a formal declaration of independence had been building through the spring of 1776, accelerated by Thomas Paine's incendiary pamphlet Common Sense, published in January, which had argued with devastating clarity that the time for reconciliation with Britain had passed. By June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia had introduced a formal resolution declaring the colonies free and independent states, and the Congress had appointed a committee of 5 to draft a document that would explain and justify that declaration to the world. The committee consisted of Jefferson, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. The question of who would write the draft was settled quickly, and the account of how it was settled, preserved in Adams's later recollections, illuminates the dynamics of the moment with characteristic clarity. Adams pressed Jefferson to take the task, offering several reasons. Jefferson was a Virginian, and Virginia's participation was essential to colonial unity. Jefferson was the better writer, and Adams, as a Massachusetts man, had already made too many enemies to serve as the document's primary author. Jefferson accepted, and in the days that followed, he retreated to his rented rooms on the corner of Market and 7th Streets to write. The physical setting of the Declaration's composition deserves attention, because it grounds the document's soaring abstractions in the material reality of a specific human being working under specific conditions. Jefferson's rooms were on the 2nd floor of a newly built brick house, comfortable but not grand. The summer heat of Philadelphia, notorious then as now, pressed against the windows. The city's sounds drifted up from the street. Cart wheels on cobblestones, the calls of vendors, the distant sound of military drilling. Jefferson worked at a portable writing desk of his own design, a compact, ingenious piece of furniture that folded flat for travel and opened to provide a writing surface, a small drawer for paper and quills, and an inkwell. It was, characteristically, a tool he had designed himself to solve a practical problem, and it is now one of the most significant objects in American history. He wrote the Declaration over approximately 17 days, working from the intellectual materials he had been accumulating for years. Locke's second treatise of government, whose argument about natural rights and the social contract provided the philosophical framework. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, drafted by George Mason just weeks earlier, which had already articulated many of the same principles in the context of Virginia's new state constitution, and his own previous writings, particularly a summary view, which had established the argumentative template he would now deploy on a larger stage. Jefferson was not inventing new ideas. He was, as he later acknowledged, attempting to express the common sense of the subject, to give eloquent and precise expression to principles that had been developing in the political philosophy of the Enlightenment for more than a century. The philosophical architecture of the Declaration is worth examining with care, because it is both more radical and more carefully constructed than its familiar cadences sometimes suggest. The document opens not with a list of grievances, but with a philosophical argument, a set of propositions about the nature of human beings and the purpose of government that are presented as self-evident truths, requiring no further demonstration. All men are created equal. They are endowed with unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are instituted to secure these rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. When a government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. This was Locke translated into American idiom, compressed and sharpened, and given a rhetorical force that Locke's own more cautious prose had never achieved. The substitution of the pursuit of happiness for Locke's property as the third unalienable right was Jefferson's own contribution, a subtle but significant shift that opened the document's promise beyond the propertied classes to a broader human aspiration. The enumeration of grievances that followed, the long list of the king's violations of colonial rights, was the evidentiary case that justified the philosophical conclusion that the colonies had the right, and indeed the obligation, to separate from a government that had so thoroughly violated its obligations. Jefferson's original draft contained a passage that, had it survived into the final document, would have changed the history of American political culture in ways that are impossible to fully calculate. In a fierce denunciation of the slave trade, Jefferson blamed King George for introducing and perpetuating the institution of slavery in the colonies, describing it as a cruel war against human nature itself, a violation of the most sacred rights of life and liberty. The passage was, in its way, a remarkable piece of moral argument, even if its logic, blaming the king for a practice that Virginia planters, including Jefferson himself, had enthusiastically embraced and profited from, was transparently self-serving. The Continental Congress deleted the passage entirely. The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia refused to accept any language that might threaten the institution of slavery, and the delegates from northern colonies, whose merchants had grown wealthy on the slave trade, acquiesced without significant resistance. Jefferson noted the deletion with evident frustration in his later account of the proceedings, preserving the original passage in his personal records as evidence of what had been lost. But the deletion was not merely a political compromise. It was a foundational American act, the nation's birth document edited at its moment of creation to protect the institution of human bondage. The contradiction that would eventually tear the nation apart was written into its founding charter not as an oversight, but as a deliberate choice. What remained after the Congress had finished its revisions was still a document of extraordinary power and consequence. The formal adoption of the Declaration on July 4, 1776, the date that would become the nation's symbolic birthday, was followed by public readings in towns and cities across the colonies, the ringing of bells, the pulling down of royal statues, and the particular mixture of exhilaration and terror that accompanies the moment when words become irrevocable action. In New York, a crowd toppled the equestrian statue of King George III on the Bowling Green. The lead subsequently melted down into musket balls for the Continental Army, a transformation of symbolic into literal ammunition that captured the spirit of the moment with accidental precision. Jefferson himself was present for the adoption, but departed Philadelphia shortly afterward, returning to Virginia to serve in the state legislature. His reasons were partly political. Virginia's new state government needed capable men, and partly personal, and deeply so. Martha Jefferson's health had been fragile for years, and Jefferson's anxiety about her condition was a persistent undercurrent beneath his public activities. The man who had just written the most consequential political document in American history was also a husband worried about his wife, and the pull of Monticello, of the mountain, the home, the people he loved, was stronger than the pull of Philadelphia's revolutionary theater. He carried with him, as he rode south through the Virginia countryside, both the satisfaction of extraordinary achievement and the knowledge of what had been compromised. The declaration he had written proclaimed that all men were created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. His enslaved valet, Bob Hemings, a member of the same Hemings family whose lives were so entangled with Jefferson's own, had been present with him throughout that Philadelphia summer, attending to his needs in the rented rooms where the Declaration had taken shape. The document and the man who served its author existed in the same physical space, breathing the same summer air, and the distance between the Declaration's promise and the reality of Bob Hemings's existence was not a distance that Jefferson had found any way to close. The summer of 1776 had changed everything: the political order of the Atlantic world, the trajectory of democratic governance, the meaning of the word equality in the vocabulary of human aspiration. It had also, in the passage it deleted and the silence it preserved, established the terms of a contradiction that would define American history for generations to come. There is a particular quality of light in Paris in the late afternoon of an autumn day, a cool, golden luminescence that falls across stone facades and cobblestone streets with the even, unhurried clarity of a civilization that has been arranging beauty for centuries. And when Thomas Jefferson first encountered it in August of 1784, he was a man in desperate need of something beautiful. He had come from grief, from humiliation, from the wreckage of a public career that had ended in near disgrace, and from the fresh wound of a personal loss so devastating that those who knew him feared for a time that he might not recover at all. Paris would not heal him, but it would remake him in ways that Virginia, for all its hold on his imagination, never could have managed. The years between Jefferson's departure from Philadelphia in 1776 and his arrival in France require accounting, because they were years that complicated the heroic narrative that the Declaration's authorship might otherwise suggest. Jefferson had returned to Virginia in the autumn of 1776 to serve in the state legislature, where he pursued an ambitious program of legal reform, drafting bills to revise Virginia's legal code, to establish a system of public education, and most significantly, to disestablish the Anglican Church and guarantee religious freedom. Many of these reforms were visionary. Some were enacted immediately. Others, including the statute for religious freedom, would wait years for passage. But the legislative work was, by any measure, consequential. His election as governor of Virginia in 1779 was a different matter entirely. The governorship of Virginia during the Revolutionary War was not a position that offered much opportunity for the kind of careful, deliberate work at which Jefferson excelled. It was a position that demanded executive decisiveness, military coordination, and the management of crisis, qualities that Jefferson possessed in far smaller measure than his intellectual gifts. When the British invaded Virginia in force in late 1780 and early 1781, first under the command of the traitor Benedict Arnold, and then under the cavalry officer Banastre Tarleton, Jefferson's response was widely judged to be inadequate. He failed to organize effective resistance. He was nearly captured at Monticello when Tarleton's raiders rode up the mountain in June of 1781, escaping with only minutes to spare, a flight that his political enemies would later characterize with deliberate cruelty as cowardice. A legislative inquiry into his conduct as governor was convened after he left office. Though the inquiry ultimately exonerated him, the experience was a profound humiliation for a man of Jefferson's pride and sensitivity. He declared that he was finished with public life, retreating to Monticello with the stated intention of devoting himself entirely to his family, his farm, and his books. For a time, it seemed he meant it. Then Martha died. Martha Jefferson had been ill with increasing severity through most of their marriage, her health undermined by multiple pregnancies and the physical demands of managing a large household. She died on September 6, 1782, at the age of 33, after months of decline during which Jefferson had rarely left her side. The grief that followed was, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, total and terrifying. Jefferson paced his room for hours. He rode alone through the Monticello woods for days at a time, barely eating, barely speaking. His daughter Martha, then 10 years old, later recalled that her father's suffering in those weeks was unlike anything she had ever seen. The man who had written so confidently about the pursuit of happiness was, for a time, a man who could not imagine its possibility. It was from this state of grief and political exile that the appointment to France arrived, and it arrived as something very close to salvation. Jefferson had served briefly in the Continental Congress after his retirement from the governorship, and in 1784 he was appointed to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in Paris as a commissioner to negotiate commercial treaties with European powers. The following year, when Franklin returned to America, Jefferson was appointed minister to France, the American Republic's chief diplomatic representative at the court of Louis XVI. The Paris that Jefferson encountered in 1784 was a city of approximately 600,000 people, the largest and most culturally sophisticated metropolis in the Western world, a place where the Enlightenment had flowered into an entire civilization of ideas, where the salons of aristocratic and bourgeois hostesses served as the primary institutions of intellectual life, where philosophy and politics and science and art were discussed with a seriousness and a brilliance that Jefferson had never encountered anywhere else. After the relative provincialism of Virginia and the practical urgency of revolutionary Philadelphia, Paris was a revelation. Jefferson threw himself into French intellectual culture with the voracious enthusiasm that characterized all his serious engagements. He attended the salons of Madame Necker, whose daughter would become the celebrated writer Madame de Staël, and corresponded with the Marquis de Condorcet on questions of natural rights, political reform, and the mathematics of voting. He visited the workshops of French craftsmen and the studios of French painters, acquiring objects and ideas with equal appetite. He attended the opera and the theatre. He haunted the bookshops along the Seine, spending money he did not have on volumes he could not resist. He estimated, later in life, that he had spent more on books during his Paris years than on any other single category of expenditure. His architectural pilgrimages during this period were among the most consequential journeys of his intellectual life. In 1787, Jefferson traveled through southern France and northern Italy, ostensibly to investigate agricultural practices and canal systems for the benefit of American commerce. But the journey was also, and perhaps primarily, a pilgrimage to the monuments of Roman antiquity that he had studied in books for 20 years and had never seen in stone. At Nimes, in the south of France, he encountered the Maison Carrée, a remarkably well-preserved Roman temple of the 1st century, its Corinthian columns and perfect proportions representing the neoclassical ideal in its purest surviving form. Jefferson wrote to a friend that he had sat for hours gazing at the building, like a man contemplating a woman he was in love with. The image is revealing. Jefferson's aesthetic responses were always deeply emotional, however rational the vocabulary in which he expressed them. The Maison Carrée confirmed and deepened his commitment to neoclassical architecture as the appropriate visual language for a republic that aspired to the civic virtues of Rome, a commitment that would reshape both Monticello and the public architecture of the new American nation. His observations of French society deepened his democratic convictions in ways that were, paradoxically, more complex than simple reinforcement. The grinding poverty of the French peasantry, visible in the countryside through which he traveled, in the ragged figures he encountered on the roads of Burgundy and Languedoc, shocked him with its severity. He wrote to James Madison from the south of France about the contrast between the opulence of the aristocracy and the misery of the rural poor, arguing that such inequality was both morally intolerable and politically unstable. The observation was genuine. It was also, in ways that Jefferson did not fully acknowledge, an observation made by a man who had left behind in Virginia an institution of human bondage whose inequalities dwarfed anything the French peasantry endured. It was in Paris in the summer of 1787, that Sally Hemings arrived. She came as a companion to Jefferson's younger daughter Mary, known as Polly, who was crossing the Atlantic to join her father and elder sister. Sally Hemings was approximately 14 years old, enslaved, and the half-sister of Jefferson's dead wife. A connection that made her presence in his household a layered and deeply troubling intimacy. She was a member of the Hemings family, whose privileged position within Monticello's enslaved community reflected their complex relationship to the Jefferson household, and she had grown up in close proximity to Jefferson's own children. The documentary addresses the relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings with the directness that the historical evidence now demands. DNA testing published in 1998, combined with the extensive circumstantial and documentary evidence assembled by historians over decades, supports with strong scholarly confidence the conclusion that Jefferson fathered at least one, and almost certainly all 6 of Sally Hemings's children, over a relationship that spanned nearly 4 decades. This was not a relationship between equals. Jefferson held absolute legal power over Hemings, over her body, her labor, her children, her future. Whatever agency she possessed was exercised within the near-total constraints of that power. What is known of Hemings's situation in Paris adds a particular dimension of moral complexity to the story. Under French law, Sally Hemings was a free person on French soil. She had the legal right to claim her freedom and remain in France. She was, by the later account of her son Madison Hemings, whose memoir, published in 1873, is among the most important primary sources on this relationship, aware of this right. According to Madison Hemings's account, his mother negotiated with Jefferson before agreeing to return to Virginia. She secured his promise to free their children when they came of age, and to provide them with certain material advantages within the constraints of their enslaved status. Whether this constitutes meaningful agency or a coerced accommodation to overwhelming power is a question that historians have debated with appropriate seriousness, and the documentary does not pretend to resolve it. What it insists upon is that Sally Hemings was a human being with her own inner life, her own calculations, her own losses, not a footnote to Jefferson's biography, but a central figure in it. Jefferson observed the opening stages of the French Revolution from his position as American minister, and his observations were those of a man simultaneously thrilled and unsettled by what he was witnessing. The convening of the Estates General in May of 1789, the formation of the National Assembly, the storming of the Bastille in July. Jefferson watched these events with the excitement of a man who believed in the universal applicability of the principles he had helped articulate in 1776. He assisted the Marquis de Lafayette in drafting an early version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He hosted dinners at his Paris residence, at which French reformers debated the architecture of a new constitutional order, with Jefferson listening and occasionally advising with the quiet authority of a man who had already lived through one revolution. But he was also, by September of 1789, preparing to leave. His plan was to return to Virginia for a brief visit, to attend to his affairs, to see Monticello, to present his daughters to Virginia society. and then to return to Paris to continue his diplomatic work. He sailed from Le Havre on September 26, 1789, with Sally Hemings and his daughters aboard, watching the French coast recede behind him. The revolution he left behind would, within months, accelerate into violence that would have horrified him. He never returned to France. The 5 years in Paris had transformed Jefferson in ways that would shape everything that followed. He had arrived a grieving widower and a humiliated former governor, and he departed as a man whose intellectual world had expanded to encompass the full breadth of European Enlightenment culture, its architecture, its philosophy, its political theory, its science, its art. He carried back to Virginia a head full of ideas about wine and pasta and architecture and political reform, along with a collection of books and objects that would fill Monticello's rooms for decades. He also carried back, in the same ship, a young enslaved woman whose life was bound to his in ways that the Declaration's language of equality could not begin to address. The diplomat who had represented the American Republic in the most sophisticated capital in the world was coming home to a mountain in Virginia, and the contradictions he had managed to hold in suspension across the Atlantic were waiting for him there, patient and unresolved. The Republic that Jefferson returned to in September of 1789 was not the revolutionary experiment he had left 5 years earlier. It was something newer, more structured, and in certain respects more alarming to a man of his political temperament. A functioning federal government, operating under a constitution ratified in his absence, with institutions and precedents already taking shape that would define the character of American governance for generations. Jefferson had read the Constitution in Paris, corresponded about it with Madison, and expressed both admiration for its architecture and anxiety about its potential for concentrated power. Now he would have to live inside it, and almost immediately fight within it. George Washington's request that Jefferson serve as the nation's first Secretary of State reached him before he had fully settled back into Monticello's rhythms, and Jefferson accepted with the ambivalence that characterized most of his entries into public life. He arrived in New York, the temporary capital, in March of 1790 to take up his duties, and what he found there confirmed his deepest anxieties about the direction the new government was taking. The social atmosphere of New York's federal circle struck him as disturbingly monarchical. Formal levees, elaborate ceremonies, the deference paid to Washington that seemed to Jefferson to echo the court protocols of the European capitals he had just left behind. The Republic, in his view, was in danger of forgetting what it was supposed to be. But the more immediate and consequential threat, as Jefferson quickly understood, came not from ceremonial excess, but from the financial vision of Alexander Hamilton, the 35-year-old Secretary of the Treasury, whose intelligence, energy, and ambition were already reshaping the federal government's relationship to the American economy. Hamilton's program, the assumption of state debts by the federal government, the establishment of a national bank, the promotion of manufacturing through protective tariffs, and the cultivation of close commercial ties with Britain, represented, in Jefferson's view, not merely a set of policy choices, but a fundamental betrayal of the Revolution's promise. The conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton was the defining political drama of the 1790s. and it was fought on terrain that was simultaneously philosophical, constitutional, and intensely personal. Hamilton believed that a strong central government, allied with the commercial and financial interests of the emerging merchant class, was the only foundation upon which a stable and prosperous republic could be built. He admired the British constitutional system, distrusted popular democracy, and regarded Jefferson's agrarian idealism as dangerously naive. Jefferson believed that Hamilton's program was designed to corrupt the republic by creating a class of financial speculators dependent on government favor, a moneyed aristocracy that would subvert the independence of the yeoman farmers he regarded as democracy's true foundation. He regarded Hamilton's admiration for Britain with something approaching horror, and Hamilton's contempt for France with equal alarm. The argument was not merely abstract. It was an argument about what kind of nation America would become, whether it would develop along the commercial, industrial, urbanizing lines that Hamilton envisioned, or remain the agrarian republic of independent farmers and limited government that Jefferson championed. History would ultimately vindicate Hamilton's economic predictions more than Jefferson's, but Jefferson's political vision of a democracy rooted in the consent and participation of ordinary citizens would prove equally durable. The two men were, in a sense, each half right, and the tension between their visions has never been fully resolved in American political life. Jefferson and Madison responded to Hamilton's dominance within Washington's cabinet by doing something that both men had publicly claimed to oppose. They built a political party, the Democratic Republican Party, organized through newspaper networks, political correspondence, and the cultivation of local political organizations across the states, was designed to mobilize popular opposition to Federalist policies and to provide an organized vehicle for the agrarian, states' rights vision of governance that Jefferson championed. The irony was not lost on Jefferson himself, a man who had written with genuine conviction about the dangers of faction and the corrupting influence of party spirit, was now the architect of one of America's first organized political parties. He managed this contradiction, as he managed so many others, by insisting that his party represented not a faction, but the true principles of the Revolution, and that Hamilton's Federalists were the real faction, the real threat to Republican government. The government relocated from New York to Philadelphia in late 1790, and Jefferson's battles with Hamilton continued in the new capital with undiminished intensity. Washington, who genuinely valued both men and was temperamentally inclined toward compromise, found himself unable to reconcile their visions and increasingly frustrated by the warfare within his own cabinet. Jefferson, for his part, grew progressively more marginalized as Hamilton's influence with Washington deepened. By the end of 1793, Jefferson had had enough. He submitted his resignation from the cabinet in July and departed Philadelphia for Monticello in January of 1794, declaring his intention to retire permanently from public life. The retirement was genuine in its emotional content, if not in its ultimate duration. Jefferson returned to Monticello with the relief of a man who had been living against his own nature and could finally stop. The estate was in a state of considerable disorder. The ongoing construction and renovation that Jefferson had been directing from a distance had produced a building site more than a home, and he threw himself into the work of redesign with the obsessive energy that physical projects always released in him. The radical renovation of Monticello that transformed it from a two-story Palladian structure into the iconic domed neoclassical Villa Familia today was largely accomplished during these years of nominal retirement, with an enslaved workforce laboring under Jefferson's exacting architectural direction. The narration pauses here to examine what Monticello's economy actually looked like during these years, because the plantation's material reality was the foundation upon which Jefferson's philosophical life rested. Among the most striking details of this period was the nail factory that Jefferson established at Monticello in 1794, operated primarily by enslaved boys between the ages of roughly 10 and 16. These children worked at forges for 10 hours a day, producing nails that were sold commercially to provide cash income for the plantation. Jefferson monitored their productivity with the same meticulous attention he brought to his architectural drawings and his scientific observations, recording their daily output in his account books with the dispassionate precision of a man tracking an agricultural experiment. The nail factory was, by the standards of the time, not considered unusual. By any standard of human decency, it was children performing coerced industrial labor for the benefit of a man who had written that all men are created equal. Jefferson's retreat to Monticello was a retreat into the material conditions that made his intellectual life possible, conditions built entirely on the labor of people he owned. The mid-1790s were turbulent years in American political life, even from the distance of Monticello's mountain. The French Revolutionary Wars had divided American public opinion sharply. Democratic Republicans sympathized with France as a sister republic, fighting the monarchies of Europe, while Federalists viewed the Revolution's violence with horror and prioritized the commercial relationship with Britain. The Jay Treaty of 1794, negotiated by Washington's administration to resolve outstanding disputes with Britain, inflamed Democratic-Republican opinion by appearing to sacrifice American commercial interests and Republican principles for the sake of peace with the former colonial power. Jefferson, watching from Monticello, regarded the treaty as a betrayal and a humiliation, and the political correspondence he maintained throughout his supposed retirement made clear that he had not genuinely withdrawn from the contest. The election of 1796 brought Jefferson back into the formal arena of national politics in a manner that illustrated the peculiarities of the constitutional system then in operation. Under the original constitutional rules, the candidate receiving the most electoral votes became president, and the runner-up became vice president, a system designed for a world without organized political parties, which had already ceased to exist. Jefferson ran as the Democratic-Republican candidate against the Federalist John Adams, lost by 3 electoral votes, and found himself serving as vice president in an administration led by a man whose political views he fundamentally opposed. The arrangement was, by any measure, absurd, a constitutional design flaw that would be corrected by the 12th Amendment in 1804, but it placed Jefferson in a position of formal prominence from which he could continue to organize opposition to Federalist governance. The Adams administration provided Jefferson with ample material for opposition. The Quasar War with France, an undeclared naval conflict that erupted from the diplomatic crisis of the XYZ affair in 1797, pushed the country toward a confrontation that Jefferson believed was both unnecessary and dangerous. More alarming still were the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, passed by the Federalist Congress in the atmosphere of war fever. Laws that extended the residency requirement for citizenship authorized the president to deport aliens deemed dangerous and criminalized criticism of the federal government. Jefferson viewed these acts as unconstitutional attacks on the First Amendment freedoms of speech and press, as evidence that the Federalists were willing to use the machinery of government to silence political opposition. His response was the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, drafted in secret and introduced into the Kentucky legislature through a political intermediary. The resolutions argued that the Constitution was a compact among sovereign states, that the federal government's powers were strictly limited to those explicitly delegated, and that individual states had the right to judge when the federal government had exceeded those powers, and by implication, to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. The doctrine was a logical extension of Jefferson's states' rights philosophy, and it provided a constitutional vocabulary for resistance to federal overreach that he believed was essential to the Republic's survival. It also, as later history would demonstrate with terrible clarity, provided a constitutional vocabulary that would be deployed to defend slavery against federal interference, a consequence that Jefferson did not intend, but that his doctrine made possible. The Kentucky Resolutions cast a long and troubling shadow across the antebellum. Decades, their logic appropriated by defenders of an institution that Jefferson himself acknowledged was a moral catastrophe. The election of 1800 was among the most consequential and most vicious in American history. The campaign against Jefferson deployed every weapon available. He was accused of atheism, of cowardice during the British invasion of Virginia, of harboring dangerous French sympathies, and in whisper campaigns whose specific content Jefferson's supporters refused to dignify with direct response, of maintaining a sexual relationship with an enslaved woman at Monticello. The accusations about Sally Hemings, published most prominently by the journalist James Callender, were substantially true, though Jefferson never acknowledged them publicly. The accusations about his religious beliefs were a distortion of his genuine heterodoxy. Jefferson was a deist who had privately rewritten the Gospels to remove supernatural elements, a fact that would have confirmed his opponent's worst characterizations had it been known. Jefferson defeated Adams in the Electoral College, but a constitutional crisis intervened before he could take office. His running mate, Aaron Burr, a New York politician whose ambitions Jefferson had always regarded with wariness, received the same number of electoral votes as Jefferson, since electors had not yet developed the practice of differentiating their votes for president and vice president. The tie through the election to the House of Representatives, where Federalist members, faced with a choice between two Democratic Republicans, engaged in 36 ballots of maneuvering before finally resolving the contest in Jefferson's favor. Hamilton's role in this resolution was decisive and historically ironic. Hamilton, who despised Jefferson's politics, nevertheless lobbied Federalist representatives to support Jefferson over Burr, judging Jefferson the less dangerous of the two. It was a judgment that would contribute, 4 years later, to the duel on the Weehawken Heights that ended Hamilton's life. Jefferson's inauguration on March 4, 1801, took place in the unfinished capital city of Washington, a place that existed more as ambition than as reality. Its muddy streets and half-constructed buildings and scattered boarding houses suggesting a nation still in the process of imagining itself into existence. Jefferson walked from his boarding house to the Capitol without ceremony, a deliberate statement of Republican simplicity that contrasted pointedly with the more formal inaugurations of his predecessors. His inaugural address, delivered in a voice so quiet that many in the chamber could not hear it, contained the famous declaration that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, an appeal to national unity that was also, characteristically, a statement of philosophical principle, that the differences between the parties were less fundamental than their shared commitment to Republican governance. The peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, what Jefferson called the Revolution of 1800, was itself, he argued, the proof that American democracy worked. The decade of fierce political struggle had brought him to the presidency. What he would do with it remained to be seen. The president's house in the early months of 1801 was a building that seemed to embody the unfinished ambitions of the nation it served. Its white sandstone walls rose from open fields of dried grass and red Virginia clay, surrounded by construction debris and the stumps of recently felled trees. The grand avenue that Peer Charles L. Enfant had designed to connect the executive mansion to the Capitol was, in practice, a muddy track that became impassable after heavy rain. Workmen still moved through the building's unfinished rooms. The East Room, intended for formal public receptions, had been used by Abigail Adams to hang the presidential laundry. The city of Washington, conceived on paper as a monument to Republican grandeur, existed on the ground as a collection of scattered buildings connected by aspirational geometry and little else. Into this raw, unfinished capital, Thomas Jefferson moved in the spring of 1801, and he proceeded to govern it in a manner that was, from the very first day, a deliberate political statement. Jefferson's presidential style was a conscious performance of Republican simplicity, calibrated to signal a decisive break from what he regarded as the quasi-monarchical formality of the Adams and Washington administrations. He received foreign diplomats in his house slippers and a worn coat, a sartorial choice that scandalized the British minister Anthony Merry and delighted Democratic Republican newspapers in equal measure. He abolished the formal levees, the weekly public receptions at which citizens had lined up to bow before the president, replacing them with informal dinner parties at which guests were seated at a round table, deliberately eliminating the hierarchical placement that had governed formal dining under his predecessors. He rode his horse through Washington streets without an escort, He answered his own door. These gestures were not merely personal preference. They were political theater, carefully designed to embody the principle that the American president was a citizen servant rather than a republican monarch, and that the republic's executive power derived its legitimacy from the people rather than from the dignity of office. His administrative priorities were equally clear and equally ideological. Jefferson had campaigned on a program of reducing the reach and cost of the federal government, and he pursued that program with genuine conviction. The national debt, which Hamilton's financial program had structured as a permanent feature of American governance, was targeted for reduction through a combination of spending cuts and the elimination of internal taxes. The excise duties that had provoked the Whiskey Rebellion and that Jefferson regarded as both economically harmful and politically tyrannical. The federal bureaucracy was trimmed, though not as dramatically as Jefferson's rhetoric had suggested it would be. The Alien and Sedition Acts were allowed to expire, and Jefferson pardoned those who had been convicted under them. His Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin, a Swiss-born financial genius whose abilities Jefferson recognized and relied upon heavily, managed the mechanics of fiscal retrenchment with impressive competence, and the national debt did indeed decline significantly during Jefferson's presidency. The foreign policy environment that Jefferson inherited was, however, considerably less tractable than the domestic one. The wars of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period were reshaping the Atlantic world with a violence and speed that made careful American neutrality both essential and increasingly difficult to maintain. Jefferson's sympathies remained with France, but Napoleon's imperial ambitions were rapidly transforming the French Republic into something that bore little resemblance to the revolutionary ideals Jefferson had witnessed taking shape in Paris in 1789. Britain's naval power, meanwhile, was asserting itself with an arrogance toward American shipping that Jefferson found both infuriating and dangerous. The young republic was attempting to conduct commerce across an Atlantic Ocean that two great powers were treating as their private battlefield, and the consequences for American merchants and sailors were severe. It was from within this turbulent international context that the most consequential opportunity of Jefferson's presidency emerged. An opportunity so unexpected, so enormous in its implications, and so constitutionally problematic that it forced Jefferson to choose between his deepest political principles and the most significant act of national expansion in American history. The Louisiana Territory, a vast expanse of land stretching from the Mississippi River westward to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico northward to the Canadian border, had been transferred from Spain to France in the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800. The news of this transfer reached Jefferson's administration with considerable alarm. Spain had been a weak and relatively accommodating neighbor along America's western frontier. France under Napoleon was something altogether different, an expansionist military power whose presence at New Orleans, controlling access to the Mississippi River, threatened the commercial lifeline of the entire American interior. Jefferson wrote to the American minister in Paris, Robert Livingston, that the moment France took possession of New Orleans, the United States must marry itself to the British fleet and nation. a remarkable statement from a man who had spent his career opposing close ties with Britain, and evidence of how seriously he regarded the French threat. The backstory of what followed involved a revolution that Jefferson had watched from a distance with deeply ambivalent feelings. In the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, enslaved people had risen in 1791 in the largest and most successful slave revolt in the history of the Atlantic world. The Haitian Revolution, as it would come to be known, had destroyed the plantation economy of what had been France's most profitable colony, killed or expelled the white planter class, and was in the process of establishing the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Napoleon had sent an army to suppress the revolution and restore French control. But the combination of Haitian resistance under leaders including Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and the devastating impact of yellow fever on French troops, had destroyed that army. By early 1803, Napoleon's American ambitions lay in ruins. Without Saint-Domingue as the agricultural foundation of a French-American empire, Louisiana was strategically worthless. He needed money for his European campaigns. And so, with the abruptness that characterized his decision-making, Napoleon offered to sell not merely New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. Jefferson's constitutional dilemma was genuine and acute. He had built his political career on the doctrine of strict construction, the argument that the federal government possessed only those powers explicitly granted to it by the Constitution's text, and that any exercise of power beyond that text was a dangerous usurpation. The Constitution said nothing about the federal government's power to acquire foreign territory. Jefferson himself drafted a constitutional amendment that would have explicitly authorized the purchase, recognizing that the existing document did not clearly permit it. But his negotiators in Paris, Livingston and James Monroe, had already agreed to terms, and the window for completing the transaction was narrow. Napoleon might change his mind. The opportunity might vanish. Jefferson set aside his constitutional scruples and proceeded. The Louisiana Purchase, completed in 1803 at a price of approximately $15 million, added roughly 828,000 square miles to the territory of the United States, effectively doubling the nation's size in a single transaction. It was, by any measure, the most consequential act of Jefferson's presidency, and one of the most consequential acts in American history. The vast territory it acquired would eventually become some or all of 15 states. It secured American control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, removing the strategic threat that had prompted the negotiation. It opened the continental interior to American settlement and expansion on a scale that Jefferson had always imagined, but had not previously possessed the means to pursue. Jefferson's decision to set aside his own constitutional principles to complete the purchase has been examined by historians with varying degrees of sympathy. Some have celebrated it as evidence of pragmatic statesmanship, a willingness to recognize that the nation's interests sometimes required flexibility in constitutional interpretation. Others have noted, with appropriate irony, that the man who had spent a decade attacking Hamilton for precisely this kind of constitutional flexibility had now embraced it himself when the opportunity suited him. Jefferson was aware of the irony. He acknowledged privately that he had stretched the Constitution until it cracked, but he believed the acquisition was too important to refuse, and he trusted that the American people, presented with the accomplished fact of a doubled national territory, would ratify his judgment. They did. The Louisiana Purchase created an immediate practical problem. Almost nothing was known, in any systematic way, about the territory that had just been acquired. Jefferson had been thinking about Western exploration for years. His curiosity about the natural world of the American interior was genuine and long-standing, and the purchase provided both the justification and the urgency for an expedition he had already been quietly planning. He selected his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to lead the Corps of Discovery, and Lewis chose William Clark as his co-commander. The expedition departed from Camp Dubois, near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, in May of 1804, and what followed was one of the great journeys of exploration in American history. The Corps of Discovery traveled up the Missouri River, crossed the Rocky Mountains with the assistance of the Shoshone guide Sacagawea, descended the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean, and returned to St. Louis in September of 1806, a journey of approximately 8,000 miles through terrain that no American expedition had previously traversed. They returned with journals, maps, botanical specimens, animal skins, and ethnographic observations that represented an extraordinary contribution to American scientific knowledge. Jefferson received their reports with the excitement of a man whose intellectual appetite had been waiting years for exactly this kind of nourishment. The flood of data about the geography, flora, fauna, and indigenous peoples of the western interior satisfied, at least partially, the insatiable curiosity that had always been among his most genuine and admirable qualities. The darker dimensions of that curiosity and of the expansion it celebrated require acknowledgement. Jefferson's vision of westward expansion was inseparable from his vision of what would happen to the Native American peoples who inhabited the territory being explored and acquired. His policy toward Native Americans was a mixture of genuine paternalism and systematic dispossession. He believed that indigenous peoples could be civilized and incorporated into American society if they adopted European agricultural practices and abandoned their traditional ways of life, and he pursued this vision through a combination of treaty negotiations, trade relationships, and the deliberate encouragement of debt that left tribal nations vulnerable to land cession. The Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition were the opening movements of a continental expansion that would, over the following century, dispossess Native American peoples of their lands with a thoroughness and violence that Jefferson's optimistic vision of peaceful assimilation had never honestly confronted. Jefferson's re-election in 1804 was a landslide. He carried every state, except Connecticut and Delaware, a margin of victory that reflected both the genuine popularity of his administration's achievements and the organizational strength of the Democratic Republican Party he had built. But the second term proved considerably more difficult than the first, as the pressures of the Napoleonic Wars bore down on American commerce with increasing severity. Both Britain and France were seizing American merchant ships, impressing American sailors into their respective navies and treating American neutral rights with contempt. Jefferson's response, the Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited American ships from trading with any foreign port, was intended to use American commercial leverage to force the European powers to respect neutral rights. It proved instead to be an economic catastrophe. The embargo devastated American merchants, sailors, and farmers whose livelihoods depended on Atlantic trade. New England, whose economy was most directly dependent on maritime commerce, was particularly hard hit, and opposition to the embargo there reached the point of open defiance and talk of secession. Jefferson enforced the embargo with a rigidity that sat uneasily alongside his stated commitment to limited government, deploying federal authority to suppress smuggling in ways that his political opponents noted, with some justice, resembled the kind of executive overreach he had spent his career condemning. The embargo was repealed by Congress in the final days of his administration, replaced by a more limited measure that exempted Britain and France. It was the most significant policy failure of Jefferson's presidency, and he knew it. By the end of his second term, Jefferson's disillusionment with the presidency was profound and genuine. He had found the office, as he wrote to a friend, a splendid misery, a position of apparent power that was in practice a daily exercise in frustration, compromise, and the management of forces largely beyond any individual's control. He had refused to seek a third term, establishing by precedent what Washington had established before him, that the Republic's chief executive would voluntarily relinquish power after 2 terms, demonstrating that the Republic's institutions were stronger than any individual's ambition. It was, in its way, among the most important things he did as president. Not an act, but an abstention, a refusal that said more about Republican virtue than any speech or policy. On March 4, 1809, Jefferson handed the presidency to his friend and political ally James Madison and departed Washington for Monticello. He was 65 years old, physically worn by 8 years of executive responsibility, financially strained by the debts that had been accumulating for decades, and deeply relieved. The road south from Washington through Virginia carried him back toward the Blue Ridge, toward the mountain he had been building and rebuilding for 40 years, toward the home that was simultaneously his greatest achievement and the site of his most irresolvable contradictions. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the nation's territory. The Lewis and Clark expedition had opened the continental interior to American knowledge and ambition. The peaceful transfer of power had demonstrated that democratic governance could survive the test of partisan conflict. These were genuine achievements, and they were his. But the 130 enslaved people whose labor sustained Monticello were waiting for him there, as they had always been, their lives bound to his in the most intimate and most terrible way, their humanity acknowledged in his private writings and denied in his daily practice. The president who had expanded the nation's boundaries was coming home to the mountain where the contradiction at the heart of his life had always been most visible, most unavoidable, and most unresolved. There is a moment, arriving at Monticello on a clear morning, when the light falls at the right angle across the dome, and the white columns catch the early sun against the backdrop of the Blue Ridge. when the house appears to be exactly what Jefferson intended it to be. A perfect embodiment of reason made physical, of Enlightenment ideals translated into brick and glass and timber, of a mind so ordered and so beautiful that it could impose harmony on the raw Virginia landscape simply by existing within it. The moment does not last. The longer one looks, the more the shadows become visible. The dependencies built into the hillside below the house, the mulberry row where enslaved people lived and worked, the entire invisible architecture of coerced human labor, without which the visible architecture of Jefferson's paradise could not have stood for a single day. Monticello is both things simultaneously, and it has always been both things, and understanding Jefferson requires holding both in view without allowing either to dissolve the other. Jefferson's decision in 1768 to build his home on the summit of a small mountain in Albemarle County was, by the practical standards of colonial Virginia, an act of deliberate eccentricity. The conventional wisdom of plantation architecture favored river bottom land, accessible, fertile, well-watered, easy to supply. Building on a mountain top required leveling the summit, a massive earth-moving operation accomplished by enslaved laborers working with hand tools over months of difficult physical effort. It required constructing a system of roads up steep slopes that defeated ordinary wagon traffic. It required solving water supply problems that a lowland site would never have presented. Jefferson chose it anyway, and the choice was entirely characteristic. The view was magnificent, the elevation was symbolic, and the difficulty of the project was, for a man of his temperament, a feature rather than a flaw. The architectural history of Monticello spans nearly 6 decades of continuous design, construction, demolition, and redesign. A building history so extended and so obsessively revised that it serves as a kind of physical autobiography of its creator's intellectual development. The first version of the house, begun in the early 1770s, was a 2-story Palladian structure of considerable elegance but relatively conventional form. A gentleman's villa in the English colonial tradition, informed by Jefferson's study of Andrea Palladio's architectural treatises and his observation of the better houses of Williamsburg and the Tidewater. It was a fine house. It was not yet Monticello as the world knows it. The transformation came after Jefferson's return from Paris in 1789. The 5 years in France had exposed him to the neoclassical architecture of the continent, the Hôtel de Salm in Paris, then under construction with its low profile and hidden roofline, the ancient Roman monuments of southern France that had overwhelmed him with their mathematical perfection, and he returned to Virginia with a completely revised architectural vision. The 2-story house was essentially demolished and rebuilt from the inside out, its roofline lowered, its exterior recomposed around the iconic dome that Jefferson had adapted from the Hôtel de Salm, its interior reorganized around the principles of spatial efficiency and ingenious convenience that he had been developing for years. The renovation took the better part of 2 decades, during which Monticello was simultaneously a construction site and a functioning household, its enslaved residents living and working amid the perpetual disruption of Jefferson's architectural ambitions. The house that emerged from this extended process of creation and recreation was, and remains one of the most architecturally sophisticated private residences in American history. Its exterior presents the illusion of a single-story building. The second floor's windows are disguised as skylights. The dependencies are buried in the hillside, creating a horizontal elegance that sits in perfect proportion with the mountain's summit. The dome, the first on an American private residence, rises from the roofline with a lightness that belies its structural complexity. The entrance hall served as a natural history museum, its walls hung with maps and its cases filled with fossil bones, Native American artifacts, and natural specimens. A physical expression of Jefferson's conviction that the home of an educated man should be a place of continuous intellectual encounter. Inside, the house was a laboratory of ingenious invention. Alcove beds built into the walls between rooms eliminated the need for separate bedrooms. A system of dumbwaiters, small shelves built into the dining room fireplace, surrounds, allowed wine bottles to be sent up from the cellar without the intrusion of servants during dinner, a convenience that served both Jefferson's desire for privacy and his preference for intimate conversation, uninterrupted by domestic traffic. Hidden staircases, narrow and steep, connected the floors while preserving the visual simplicity of the main rooms. The skylights that illuminated the upper floor created a quality of diffuse natural light that Jefferson had studied in French architecture and reproduced with careful attention to orientation and proportion. Every detail reflected the same underlying impulse, the application of rational intelligence to the problem of beautiful, functional living. And every detail was built by enslaved human beings. At the peak of Jefferson's residence at Monticello, approximately 130 enslaved people lived and worked on the mountain and the surrounding plantation. They were not an undifferentiated mass of labor. They were individuals with names and skills and family relationships and inner lives that the historical record preserves only partially, but that the documentary insists upon acknowledging with the specificity the evidence allows. The Hemings family occupied a privileged position within Monticello's enslaved hierarchy, privileged in the relative sense that their proximity to Jefferson's household gave them certain material advantages, and in some cases, opportunities for skilled work and eventual freedom that the field laborers did not share. John Hemings, a master carpenter whose craftsmanship is visible in the woodwork of Monticello's interior, was among the most skilled artisans in Virginia. Joseph Fawcett, a blacksmith of exceptional ability, ran the plantation's ironworking operations. These men were not merely laborers. They were craftsmen whose skills were essential to the physical realization of Jefferson's architectural vision, and whose knowledge and expertise Jefferson relied upon and documented in his meticulous account books, while simultaneously denying them the freedom to deploy those skills on their own behalf. The field workers whose labor produced the tobacco and wheat that funded Jefferson's lifestyle and his debts are less individually visible in the historical record, their names appearing in Jefferson's account books primarily as entries in labor tallies and agricultural records. Their work was harder, their conditions more exposed to the weather and the overseer's authority, their lives more completely defined by the rhythms of agricultural production. They planted and cultivated and harvested. They cleared land and built fences and maintained the roads that connected the mountaintop to the wider world. They were the foundation upon which everything else rested, and the documentary pauses to insist that their invisibility in most accounts of Jefferson's life is itself a historical distortion that requires correction. Jefferson's documented views on slavery constitute one of the most extensively analyzed and most morally troubling bodies of writing in American intellectual history. He was not a man who was unaware of the institution's evil. In Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, he wrote with apparent anguish about slavery's corrupting effects on both the enslaved and the enslaver, arguing that the relationship between master and slave was a perpetual exercise in tyranny that degraded the moral character of those who practiced it. His famous metaphor of holding a wolf by the ears, unable to hold on, unable to let go, expressed with genuine literary force the paralysis he claimed to feel. A man who acknowledged the evil of slavery, but professed himself unable to see a path toward its elimination that would not produce greater catastrophe. The metaphor was honest about the paralysis. It was less honest about its causes. Jefferson's inability to act against slavery was not simply a matter of political impossibility, though the political obstacles were real. It was also a matter of financial dependency so complete that the liberation of his enslaved workforce would have meant the immediate collapse of his economic world. Monticello's debts, accumulated through decades of extravagant building, lavish hospitality, and living consistently beyond the plantation's productive capacity, were secured against the value of the enslaved people themselves. They were, in the brutal accounting of the time, collateral. Jefferson could not free them without defaulting on obligations that would have destroyed his estate and his reputation simultaneously. He freed only 8 enslaved people in his lifetime, and in his will, 5 of them members of the Hemings family, widely believed by historians to be his own children by Sally Hemings. The remaining enslaved people at Monticello, approximately 130 men, women, and children, were sold after his death to pay his debts. They were dispersed to buyers across Virginia and beyond, their families separated. The community they had built on the mountain over decades dissolved in the transactions of an estate auction. Jefferson had written that all men are created equal. The people whose labor had built and sustained the house in which he wrote those words were sold like furniture to settle his accounts. Jefferson's intellectual life at Monticello during his retirement, years after 1809, was, by any measure, extraordinary. His library had grown to nearly 6,500 volumes, the largest private library in America, encompassing works in multiple languages on every subject from ancient history to contemporary science, from classical poetry to agricultural chemistry. When the British burned the Library of Congress during the War of 1812, Jefferson sold his collection to Congress for approximately $23,950, providing the core around which the reconstituted National Library would be built. The sale was both a patriotic gesture and a financial necessity. The money provided temporary relief from the debt burden that was slowly crushing him, and Jefferson immediately began acquiring books again, rebuilding his personal collection with the compulsive energy of a man for whom books were not merely possessions, but necessities of existence. His scientific instruments, fossil collections, and correspondence network reflected the same insatiable curiosity. He exchanged letters with naturalists, philosophers, politicians, and scientists across 3 continents, maintaining an intellectual life of remarkable breadth and vitality from the relative isolation of his Virginia mountain. The correspondence alone, Jefferson wrote, and received tens of thousands of letters over his lifetime, constitutes a primary source of extraordinary richness for understanding not only his own mind, but the intellectual world of the early American Republic. The founding of the University of Virginia in 1819 was, in Jefferson's own estimation, among the most important achievements of his life. More important, he suggested, than the presidency. He designed the university himself, in the neoclassical style he had championed throughout his career, organizing its buildings around the academical village. A central lawn flanked by 10 pavilions housing faculty residences and classrooms, connected by colonnaded walkways, anchored at one end by the rotunda, a half-scale adaptation of the Roman Pantheon that served as the university's library. The design was a physical argument about the nature of education, that learning was a communal enterprise conducted in beautiful spaces that honored the dignity of intellectual inquiry, that the library rather than the chapel should occupy the place of honor at the center of academic life, and that a secular institution dedicated to free inquiry was the appropriate educational foundation for a democratic republic. The university was conceived as a genuinely secular institution, unusual for its time, and deliberately so. Jefferson excluded theology from its curriculum, believing that religious instruction belonged to the churches rather than to a public university, and that the mixing of religious authority with academic inquiry was corrosive to both. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which he had drafted in 1777, and which the Virginia legislature had finally passed in 1786, had established the principle of separation between church and state in Virginia's law. The University of Virginia embodied that principle in its institutional design. Monticello in Jefferson's final years was a place of intellectual vitality and financial desperation existing in painful proximity. Visitors arrived in a steady stream: politicians, intellectuals, foreign dignitaries, ordinary citizens who simply wanted to see the great man. And Jefferson received them with the gracious hospitality that Virginia gentry culture demanded, feeding and housing them at an expense he could not afford. The debts continued to accumulate. The plantation's agricultural income was insufficient to service them. Jefferson's attempts to address his financial situation through a lottery of his properties, a scheme that required special legislative authorization, and that he pursued with the humiliating urgency of a man who understood he was running out of time, came too late and produced too little. When Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, he left behind a mountain of personal debt that made the liberation of his enslaved workforce not merely difficult, but legally impossible. The estate's creditors had prior claim on its assets, and those assets included the people who had spent their lives on the mountain. Monticello itself, the house he had spent 60 years designing and redesigning, the physical embodiment of his intellectual life and his deepest aesthetic convictions, was sold. The enslaved community was dispersed. The library was gone. The mountain remained, as it always had, the blue ridge visible on clear days, the red clay soil unchanged, the view that had anchored Jefferson's imagination since childhood still magnificent in the late afternoon light. Monticello stands today as a physical space of irresolvable contradiction, the most beautiful and intellectually sophisticated private home in early America, built on the labor of enslaved human beings by a man who wrote that all men are created equal. The house and the quarters below it, the dome and the dependencies, the library and the nail factory, they are not separate things. They are one thing, inseparable, and the history they embody is not Jefferson's history alone. It is the history of a nation that built its founding. Ideals and its foundational injustice simultaneously in the same moment with the same hands on the same mountain. He had asked to be remembered for three things: not the presidency, not the Louisiana Purchase, not the diplomatic triumphs or the political battles, or the 2 terms in the most powerful office the new republic had yet created. Thomas Jefferson composed his own epitaph before he died, and the 3 achievements he chose, the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the founding of the University of Virginia, were all acts of intellectual creation, all documents or designs rather than exercises of executive power. The choice was revealing in the way that all of Jefferson's most deliberate self-presentations were revealing. It told the truth about what he valued while carefully managing what it omitted. The epitaph said nothing about the 600 enslaved people whose labor had sustained the world in which those intellectual achievements were possible. Jefferson's retirement years at Monticello, from 1809 until his death in 1826, were a period of genuine intellectual vitality, existing in increasingly desperate proximity to financial ruin. The debts that had been accumulating for decades, the product of extravagant building, lavish hospitality, agricultural operations that consistently failed to generate sufficient income, and the compound interest that turned manageable obligations into catastrophic ones, had by the end of his life reached approximately $107,000, a sum equivalent to millions in contemporary terms. The weight of that debt shaped everything about Jefferson's final years. His inability to free his enslaved workforce, his increasingly frantic attempts to find financial relief, his awareness that the estate he had spent 60 years creating would almost certainly not survive him intact. The correspondence with John Adams that filled much of this period stands as one of the remarkable intellectual exchanges in American letters, and it arrived as a kind of gift in the midst of financial anxiety. The 2 men had been estranged for years. Their political rivalry during the 1790s and the viciousness of the 1800 campaign had opened wounds that neither had found easy to close. It was the Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush who engineered their reconciliation, writing to both men in 1811 with the gentle insistence of a mutual friend who understood that the Republic's 2 great survivors owed each other, and owed history something better than silence. Jefferson responded first, and Adams replied with characteristic directness, and what followed over the next 15 years was an exchange of letters ranging across philosophy, religion, politics, science, the nature of aristocracy, the meaning of the revolution, and the prospects for human progress that reads today as a sustained meditation on what it meant to have lived through the founding of a nation. The two men were, in their old age, more honest with each other than either had been in the heat of political combat. Adams was blunter, more pessimistic, more willing to acknowledge the gap between revolutionary ideals and human nature. Jefferson remained more optimistic, more committed to the Enlightenment faith in reason and progress, more inclined to believe that the arc of history bent toward liberty. Their disagreements were genuine and productive, their mutual respect evident beneath the philosophical sparring, their shared awareness of mortality giving the correspondence an urgency and a tenderness that their earlier relationship had never achieved. They were old men who had helped make a world, writing to each other across the distance of their respective retirements, trying to understand what they had done. The morning of July 4, 1826, arrived as the 50th anniversary of the Declaration's adoption, a date that the surviving founders had been contemplating with a mixture of pride and mortality for years. Jefferson had been declining for months, his body finally yielding to the accumulated weight of 83 years. He had rallied briefly in the preceding days, as though determined to reach the anniversary, and he died in the early afternoon of July 4th at Monticello. John Adams died the same day at his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, hours after Jefferson. Adams's reported last words, that Jefferson still survived, were wrong by the margin of those few hours, and the coincidence of their deaths on the Republic's 50th birthday struck contemporaries as something beyond the merely historical. It seemed to belong to a different order of meaning entirely, as though the nation's founding generation had arranged its own departure with the same deliberate symbolism that had characterized its founding acts. Jefferson was buried at Monticello beneath the epitaph he had written on the slope of the mountain he had loved since childhood. The grave was simple, the stone modest, the inscription exactly what he had specified. He had been precise about this, as he was precise about most things. He wanted to be remembered for what he had given to the world through thought and writing, not for the offices he had held or the power he had wielded. The Declaration, the statute, the university, these were his gifts, and he wanted them acknowledged as such. The Declaration of Independence's intellectual legacy across the subsequent 2 centuries constitutes one of the most complex and contested stories in American political history. Jefferson had written a document whose central proposition, that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, was radical enough to justify a revolution against the most powerful empire on earth, and capacious enough to serve as the foundation for claims of equality that Jefferson himself had never intended and would not have endorsed. Abraham Lincoln understood this with characteristic clarity. At Gettysburg in 1863, dedicating a cemetery on the ground where the Civil War's bloodiest battle had been fought, Lincoln reached back to 1776 rather than 1787, to the Declaration rather than the Constitution, to locate the nation's founding promise. The proposition that all men are created equal was, in Lincoln's reading, the nation's true founding commitment, and the Civil War was the test of whether a nation so conceived could endure. Frederick Douglass had made a version of the same argument, with more anguish and more anger, in his great 1852 speech asking what the 4th of July meant to the American slave. Douglas knew Jefferson's words. He had read them and thought about them, and understood their power and their hypocrisy simultaneously. The Declaration's promise was real. He argued, real enough to indict the nation that had made it, and then systematically violated it, real enough to serve as the standard by which American slavery could be measured and condemned. The document that Jefferson had written while his enslaved valet waited in the next room had become, in the hands of those it had excluded, the most powerful argument for their inclusion. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in August of 1963 and invoked the Declaration's promissory note, the language of unalienable rights and human equality, as a check that America had defaulted on and that the civil rights movement was demanding be honored. Jefferson's words, written by a slaveholder in a summer of revolutionary urgency, had traveled through nearly 2 centuries of American history to become the vocabulary of a movement demanding the freedom of the descendants of the people Jefferson had owned. The irony was not lost on King, who was too sophisticated a reader of American history to miss it. He used Jefferson's language anyway, because it was the most powerful language available, because it was the nation's own stated promise, and because the gap between that promise and American reality was precisely the indictment he needed to make. Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, enacted by the Virginia legislature in 1786 after years of legislative struggle, established in law the principle that the state had no authority over the religious beliefs or practices of its citizens, that civil rights could not be conditioned on religious affiliation, and that compelling any citizen to support a religion through taxation was a violation of natural rights. The statute was the direct ancestor of the First Amendment's religion clauses, and its influence on the constitutional architecture of American religious liberty has been profound and lasting. Jefferson regarded it as among his most important contributions precisely because it addressed a form of tyranny, the coercion of conscience, that he considered among the most fundamental violations of human freedom. The secular republic he envisioned, in which the government was genuinely neutral among religious traditions and genuinely indifferent to the religious beliefs of its citizens, remained a contested ideal in his own time and has remained contested ever since. The University of Virginia, which admitted its first students in 1825, the year before Jefferson's death, represented his most sustained attempt to give institutional form to his Enlightenment convictions about education, reason, and democratic citizenship. The academical village he designed, its rotunda, its pavilions, its colonnaded walkways, its deliberate centering of the library rather than the chapel as the heart of academic life, remains one of the most architecturally coherent and intellectually purposeful university campuses in America. Jefferson's vision of a secular institution dedicated to free inquiry, where students would encounter the full range of human knowledge without the constraint of religious orthodoxy, was genuinely radical for its time and genuinely influential on the subsequent development of American public higher education. The University of Virginia was also, from its founding, an institution that excluded the enslaved people whose labor had built it, and the free black citizens of Virginia who might have benefited from it. Jefferson's vision of democratic education was like his vision of democratic governance, a vision with a defined and limited constituency. The legacy of Jefferson's failures and contradictions is not separable from the legacy of his achievements. It is the same legacy, and the documentary insists on holding both in view simultaneously, as Monticello itself demands. Jefferson owned more than 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. He freed 8 of them. He maintained a decades-long relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman he held in legal bondage, over whom he exercised absolute power, and with whom he fathered at least 6 children, and he never publicly acknowledged that relationship or those children. He wrote in notes on the state of Virginia that he suspected black people might be intellectually inferior to white people. A pseudoscientific speculation that had no empirical foundation, and that contradicted the natural rights philosophy he claimed to hold, but that served the psychological function of making the institution of slavery slightly more bearable to a man who knew it was wrong. He argued in his later years that the younger generation would find a way to end slavery. Deferring to a future he would not live to see the responsibility that his own generation had refused to discharge. The 19th century's hagiographic tradition largely ignored these facts, constructing a Jefferson who was a demigod of democracy, the apostle of human freedom, the philosopher-statesman whose vision had made America possible. The monuments and the memorials and the naming of public institutions reflected this tradition. Jefferson's face on the nickel and the $2 bill, the Jefferson Memorial on the Washington Tidal Basin, the Jefferson Airplane and Jefferson County and Thomas Jefferson High School in 100 American cities. The tradition was not entirely wrong. Jefferson's intellectual contributions were real and consequential, but it was profoundly incomplete, and its incompleteness was not accidental. It served the psychological needs of a nation that wanted to believe its founding was unambiguously noble. The 20th century's civil rights movement complicated this tradition in ways that proved irreversible. The descendants of the people Jefferson had owned were demanding their full citizenship under the terms of a document Jefferson had written, and the gap between that document's promise and the reality of American racial hierarchy made the hagiographic Jefferson increasingly untenable. The DNA evidence published in 1998, confirming with high probability that Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings, forced a public reckoning with a dimension of Jefferson's biography that the hagiographic tradition had suppressed for nearly 2 centuries. The contemporary debates over monuments and memorials, over whether Jefferson's name should remain on public schools, whether his statues should stand in public squares, are the latest iteration of a conversation that American society has been having with varying degrees of honesty since the Republic's founding. The question of what to do with Jefferson, how to hold his achievements and his failures in the same frame, how to honor what was genuinely honorable without erasing what was genuinely terrible, is not a question that admits of a simple answer. It is, in a deeper sense, the question of what to do with America itself, because the contradictions Jefferson embodied were not his personal eccentricities. They were the nation's founding contradictions, written into its birth documents and its constitutional structure, present from the first moment and unresolved still. Jefferson had written that the earth belongs to the living, that each generation must make its own choices, write its own laws, bear its own moral responsibilities. The observation was characteristically elegant and characteristically self-serving. It allowed him to defer the problem of slavery to future generations while benefiting from it in his own. But the principle, stripped of its self-serving application, contains something true. Each generation does inherit the contradictions of its predecessors and bear the responsibility of confronting them with whatever honesty and courage it can muster. The final light at Monticello falls in the late afternoon across the dome and the columns and the blue ridge beyond, golden and unhurried, indifferent to the human drama the mountain has witnessed. The slave quarters on Mulberry Row are in shadow by the time the house catches the last of the sun. A daily visual fact that the site's interpreters now insist upon acknowledging, refusing the older tradition that kept the camera on the dome and looked away from what lay below. The mountain holds both things, the dome and the quarters, the library and the nail factory, the declaration and the auction block. It has always held both things. The history it embodies is not finished. It is the history Americans are still living inside, still arguing about, still trying to understand well enough to deserve the promise that was made and broken and made again, in the name of a nation that has never fully become what its most eloquent founder said it was.